Hi guys, Luke here from XM2 Labs. Today I'm going to guide you through the installation process of the SLG-20 AX Retractable Landing Gear set for the Freefly Systems Alta X. On the left here we've got the tube set for the landing gear. It will include some hardware to install it to the aircraft. We've got the two landing gear modules which also bolt to the aircraft. One XT30 Y cable for power, one servo lead Y cable for signal, and then we've also got an extension lead for the video transmitter. These are the tools that are required to install the modules. One 2mm straight cut driver, one 2.5mm straight cut driver, one 2.5mm ball end driver, one 3mm straight cut driver, and 4 zip ties. One side cutters to trim the zip ties down, and then we recommend Loctite 222 thread locker. Start by installing these 25 to 25mm tube adapters to the lower tube. And use the one that we provided to match the alignment. Make sure you apply the Loctite to each bolt before tightening gently these ones only. Next we'll install the vertical tubes to the horizontal tube. So first ensure that the hook for retaining the spring is facing directly upwards and insert it into the tube holder. Make sure it's fully seated. Same as before, ensure there's Loctite on the bolts. Once they're all aligned and flat, then we can go ahead and firmly tighten all of these bolts. For this next step, you'll want to place your aircraft upside down so you have easy access to the bolts underneath. And we can start by removing 8 bolts on the underside of the frame. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. They're a combination of M3 and M4, so you will need to use different tools. These are all depicted in the diagram in the Quick Start manual. Next, we're going to install the XT30 power Y lead, and this plugs into the power expansion port on the Freefly Alta X. It is a little bit difficult to access, so you might need to use some small pliers or just have really small fingers so you can get in there and plug it in. Next we'll install the short end of the signal Y lead into the receiver housing and plug it into the appropriate channel on your receiver. Pay attention to the signal direction. This video transmitter extension cable allows you to relocate your video transmitter from one side of the aircraft to the other if you are finding that it interferes with the retracts. Next we'll install the hardware to the retract modules. Don't forget to apply a small amount of thread locker. There are 10 bolts per side and one is an M4 bolt. Now take the modules with the pre-installed hardware and place them into the location on the airframe. Make sure that all of the bolt holes are aligned correctly. Once in place, we can use a 2.5mm driver to begin to tighten. Do not tighten them all of the way. Make sure when you're installing the modules to just start the thread on each bolt, and then once every bolt is engaged, you can go around and tighten them up. Next up, we're going to supply power to the module, so take the XT30 lead, plug it in. Note that one side of the XT30 Y lead is longer than the other, so you might need to use longer side to reach the one that's further away. Next, we'll take the signal Y lead, and note that one side is shorter than the other. And we're going to plug that into the signal part of the retract PCB, one for each side. And now we just need to manage the cables by installing cable ties to hold them onto the frame. I would normally use 4 cable ties. Once the zip ties are in place, take the side cutters and trim down the excess. Before proceeding to the next step, we need to put the retract modules to the down position. So you just push this linkage here, and then you can raise it. Make sure your transmitter's on and then power up the aircraft. Alright, now that we've applied power to the aircraft, the next step is to check the functionality of the Retracts via the remote control. So we've configured our remote controller here to this switch. So when I actuate the switch, the landing gear goes up and it also goes down. And then the other part you should check is the fail-safe function. So when the landing gear is up and you're, for example, flying around, if something happens to your controller, for example, it switches off, the landing gear will come down so that the aircraft can land safely. For the next step, ensure to remove power from the aircraft. Now take your pre-assembled landing gear tubes and install them into the Retract module. Make sure that the tubes are fully seated, and you can tell that by looking through this window here, and make sure that there's no gap. With the tubes fully seated, you can use these thumb screws to clamp them in place. Once those are firm, we'll just hook the Retract springs onto these holders. Now we're going to manually actuate the landing gear to the up position, and that's why it's critical that there's no power applied to the aircraft, because you don't want your fingers to get jammed in the mechanisms. Apply force to the middle of the linkage here where the wire is, so that it folds backwards, and then that allows you to raise the landing gear to the top position. In this step, we'll be checking the spring tension is sufficient. So actuate the landing gear to the upward position and pay attention to these linkages here. If they're parallel, that means that there's sufficient spring tension. These two linkages are not quite parallel, and that means there's insufficient spring tension. So we correct that by loosening off the little bracket holding the spring and moving it away from the module and applying more tension. As you can see, that mechanism then came over on itself, and that's exactly what we want. Now, if we want to just verify that that's working correctly, we push on these linkages here and then come back up into that position, and you can see it's correct. If there is too much spring tension, you won't be able to physically push these linkages with your fingers. In this step, we just need to make sure that everything is mechanically square. As you can see, this bottom horizontal tube is not parallel with the attitude of the aircraft, and it's not horizontal when you look at it from a distance. So we need to correct that, and how we do that is by loosening the top two bolts on the tube holders, and then you can rotate the assembly until it is horizontal and lock it in place. Now apply pressure to these two linkages and lower the landing gear on both sides. For the final step, ensure that your transmitter is powered on, and then apply power to the aircraft. Wait for the Retracts and aircraft to initialize. And then we can actuate it using the switch on the transmitter.